Hello, my name's Philip Dawson and I'd like to talk with you about evaluating learning and teaching. How can we know if someone's a good teacher, if something is good teaching, if students are learning? How do we know? Well, if you've ever been in this sort of scenario, let's make a survey to decide who is a good teacher and therefore a bad teacher. I hope you felt unsure about this. I hope there was something that bubbled up about, how do we even define what good teaching is? And yeah, I'm just not too comfortable with this. Anyway, if you don't already feel that way, I hope you feel that way by the end of this lecture. So in this video, we'll talk about criteria for evaluating learning and teaching. We'll talk about legislative and research perspectives on what good teaching is, because what good teaching is legislated. We'll talk about why evaluating learning and teaching is hard, and we'll talk about that SETU survey and what we can do for minimal effort to get maximal gains in it. So, back to this question. Let's make a survey to decide who is a good teacher and therefore who is a bad teacher. Well, what are we measuring? What do we want to find out? What even is good teaching? Well, if you start with the survey, you're going to have a bad time. Perhaps a better question might be, well, what are the indicators of effective teaching? How do we know? That way we can write the survey to do it. Okay, what does indicate good teaching? I mean, I'm sure you've looked at things like a SETU survey and said, well, this survey tells me an idea of what good teaching is that I may or may not agree with. You know, the survey asks about challenge or being stimulated to learn, but that's not necessarily what learning is in my big first year unit with heaps of content to cover or whatever. Okay, so perhaps we instead say, what are the criteria of effective teaching? What exactly is it that we want those indicators to measure? You know, is effective teaching about learning? Is effective teaching about being inspired? Is effective teaching about getting people in and out on time? But actually, maybe before that we should think, well, yeah, what is effective teaching before we jump straight to the criteria? And even bigger than what is effective teaching, well, what is the goal of education? Now, I'm sure you've got some answers to each of those questions that are very personal to your understanding of what education is. And that's great, they're really valid. Try and be upfront with them and try to resist when people jump straight to designing a survey or looking for indicators of effective teaching. See if you can change that discussion into, well, what is the goal of education? How can we define some criteria from that? And then how can we get some indicators? Because if you jump straight to the survey, you're going to have a bad time. So let's jump straight to the indicators that you're measured by. Let's see what your practical reality is. And you're going to be measured by some or all of these in your teaching practice. Learning. You might be measured by learning. How much do your students learn? Might be pre-post. Do they learn a lot from your unit? You start off with students who don't know much stuff about this and they end up knowing lots of stuff about this. Interestingly, I really doubt that you are measured by how much your students learn. I doubt there's any performance metrics for you about how much they learn. Perhaps there's a bad scenario where if they do your unit and they don't learn this stuff that they need to know for the next unit, then you get in trouble because they didn't learn enough. But I'd say that outside of that scenario, you're probably not measured a lot by how much your students learn. I find that really problematic. Engagement. Are students there in class? Are they paying attention? Are they showing up on time? Do they seem to have that enthusiasm and love for your stuff? This tends to be privileged over learning for some reason. You might be measured by engagement. There are surveys of engagement, really large-scale ones that we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on administering. Success. Do students pass your unit? Success really matters. You might be hauled before some committee if not enough percentage of students pass your unit. Or if people who do your unit end up all dropping out of their degree or some nightmarish scenario like that, you might get judged on failure. There are some weird, perverse academic cultures that think a unit should have a failure rate. It should have 5–10% of people fail the unit, otherwise it's not hard enough. You might be judged based on this. If you are, I feel sorry for you. Retention. Are you able to just keep the students in your unit? If the student drops out before the census date, then the university loses money. You are losing the university money by making your unit something people don't want to stay in. So you might be judged by retention if people just keep dropping out of your unit. Load. Student load is measured by all sorts of bizarre formulae. Number of hours that you teach, equivalent full-time student load, or EFTL, or other bizarre numbers. Interestingly, with research performance, you're probably measured by output, number of publications in these sorts of journals. With students in your classes, you sort of get given a bit of a load and you teach that. And is a good teacher someone who teaches twice as many students as someone else with the same resources? Well, I don't know. But you might be judged based on student load. Customer satisfaction. These SETU type surveys at the end. They're customer satisfaction surveys. They're not surveys of learning. If someone tries to say that students clearly aren't learning anything in your unit because your SETUs are too low, then I would disagree. I'd say they could still be learning. They're clearly not satisfied though. I think we should really value what the SETU tells us, but we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking it tells us things it doesn't. Or gut feeling. Sometimes when evaluating learning and teaching, we know if we've done a good job ourselves, and sometimes our colleagues develop ideas about us as to whether we're good teachers or not, largely based on this gut feeling. But let's look at what researchers suggest that we should look at for indicators of good quality learning and teaching. Well, I'm sure you've figured out by now I'm going to say learning is what the student does. So an indicator of good learning and teaching is the students doing things that lead to learning. If your students spend a very, very small amount of time engaged in your unit, I would think that that's not great learning and teaching. They need to be doing things. They need a substantial time investment in doing stuff that leads to your learning outcomes. So that's mine, and I'm obviously borrowing the words of Biggs there. Now I think you should have a look at this Devlin article. There's a table on pages 116 to 117. You'll need to rotate it, Control R, Apple R. It has a really good synthesis of different definitions of what effective teaching is, and these link into teaching award criteria. These link into university performance management criteria as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that article if you're interested in what exactly is good teaching and how can we evaluate it. But here we go a bit text heavy, because we're going to look at what indicators the legislation mandate. So the Tertiary Education Quality and Standards Agency Act of 2011, in that chapter and section, begins with this phrase, teaching and learning are of high quality, because obviously TEQSA is interested in high quality learning and teaching. That's kind of what it exists for. But how does it know or define what good learning and teaching are? Well, the numbers, qualifications, experience, expertise, and sessional full-time mix of the staff who teach the course and the support staff are appropriate to the nature, level, mode of delivery, blah, blah. Okay, so here they are very interested in who is teaching the course. How are they qualified? How many people are teaching the course? What's their expertise? Are they sessional full-time, etc.? So the legislation begins in defining quality learning and teaching by how many of us there are, how good at it we are, based on expertise and qualifications, and sessional full-time mix. So we'd therefore assume that with this point, if we had lots of full-time academic staff who all have graduate certificates in academic practice or graduate certificate in higher education. And there's a really good staff to student ratio that this is good quality learning and teaching. Awesome. I'm not going to disagree with you there. I think that's a nice idyllic scenario. The higher education provider ensures that staff who teach students in the course of study are appropriately qualified in the relevant discipline for their level of teaching, qualified to at least one qualification standards level higher than the course of study. So essentially, if you're teaching an undergrad course, you should have the next qualification up from that bachelor degree. If you're teaching a master's level course, then you should have a doctorate. That sort of thing seems reasonably straightforward. You wouldn't want someone with less expertise than that. If you've ever taught as a PhD student, only holding a bachelor degree inside a bachelor degree, then TEXA wouldn't have liked this happening, would they? Okay, the higher education provider ensures that staff who teach students in the course of study have a sound understanding of current scholarship and professional practice in the discipline that they teach. So this is actually a bit of an argument for a teaching research nexus as part of a quality learning and teaching indicator. Active researchers are going to be better teachers according to this. Or even just people who have kept up with the scholarship or keep up with the reading. They have an understanding of pedagogical and or adult learning principles relevant to the student cohort being taught. Fairly straightforward, knowing how to teach and being able to abstract that away to a level of pedagogical principles or adult learning principles. Cool. They engage students in intellectual inquiry appropriate to the level of the course of study and unit being taught. Yes, we want things to be appropriate to the level of study. Are advised of student and other feedback on the quality of their teaching and have opportunities to improve their teaching. Now, if you are in a scenario where you don't have access to your SETU comments, the qualitative comments that students write to you at the end, perhaps you could have a chat with your performance management team and point out this part of the TEXA Act to them and say, well, the TEXA Act says that for me to do quality teaching, I need access to student and other feedback. The higher education provider ensures that academic staff who teach on a course of study are reasonably available for students seeking academic assistance for units within the course of study, so some sort of consultation time. The higher education provider has effective mechanisms to identify and support students who are at risk of not progressing academically, so some sort of an early warning system, or even just, if I notice students aren't showing up to my class, maybe I should do some follow-up. Maybe the Act tells me I should. And the higher education provider has effective arrangements to assure the quality of student work placements, practicum and other forms of work integrated learning in the course of study, including assuring the quality of supervision. I think this is in here because there have been some somewhat nightmarish work integrated learning scenarios and also some somewhat dodgy sort of go make the coffee and operate the photocopier work placements in university degrees, and they don't really have a role there. Okay, so that was the legislative imperative. That was what the Act says. Monash passes down some of that to you. So I encourage you to read the Monash Qualitative and Quantitative Performance Standards for Education. This is a nice big long list of things, and see if you can tick some of them off. I expect you'll be able to tick some off that you didn't know you were doing, that you didn't know might actually be ways that you are a quality teacher. I also would like you to consider if you can introduce them into performance management or promotion, wherever you are in the scheme of things, whether you sit on the more powerful or less powerful side of things. Because these standards are supposedly what we are evaluated on when it comes to good quality learning and teaching, and I guarantee you that these go far beyond SETU. Have a look, see if you can get your performance management supervisor in on this. But if you are in the situation where SETU is everything, where You are only evaluated on that number at the end. Be physically attractive. Yeah, seriously, this will improve your SETU. More physically attractive teachers get better SETU. And this is really sad, isn't it? Because physical attractiveness really, as we've defined quality learning and teaching before, has nothing to do with quality teaching. The TEXA Act, the Monash Performance Standards, those don't consider being physically attractive. Yet, an indicator of good teaching that both of those consider, the SETU, do. Okay, another alternative, you could try being extroverted. If you aren't extroverted, you can fake it. I am actually quite an introverted person, but Phil as teacher is somewhat extroverted. You know, waving my hands around, getting enthusiastic, etc. Now, if you want something more meaningful, I actually like this last article because it advocates that we satisfy our students' psychological needs by making them feel autonomous, competent, and related and connected. And developing students' sense of autonomy is actually a valuable thing, because if we want them to go out and be professionals post their degree, one of the things they need to be is autonomous. They also do need to be competent. Now, this is a sense of being competent. It's not actual competence. So if you wanted to game this, you could tell them that they are very competent regardless of how competent they are. That would be kind of evil though. What I propose instead is develop in them the ability to evaluate their own competence. And feeling related and connected, knowing people in class, knowing you, talking to people regularly. This will help them feel related and connected. Now pick any one of these three, focus on it, and I expect it'll improve your SETU. But I also hope it'll show you that SETU is not everything. Thanks a lot.